Good evening. Welcome, neighbors and friends. You have joined the third of our public workshops to gather input regarding the Park Avenue project. So welcome. We're glad you're here this evening. My name is Valerie Chapman, and I am the chair of the Park Avenue Community Advisory Committee. Also here tonight is Ann Muir, who will speak a little later in the evening. She is the vice chair of the committee. We both live with our respective families within a couple of blocks of the Park Avenue station, which is the center point for the Park Avenue project. I want to begin by thanking our community partners who have made this project possible. The McLaughlin Area Plan Implementation Team, the 12 members of the Community Advisory Committee, Metro's 2040 grant funding, planning, zoning, business, and community services personnel from Clackamas County, and the team at Sarah Architects. Thank you, all of you, for your outstanding work. So this is the last of 3 workshops that have been put together to gather community input regarding the dreams and plans for the general commercial areas within the half mile of the transit station. Our first workshop was in person, if you can believe that, way back in February. But of course, with the pandemic, our options for community involvement have been severely limited. However, I do want to say that with the skills of personnel from Sarah and from the county, we have been able to provide online workshops and surveys that have been very well responded to. In fact, there is a survey, a new one that's online now, and we will tell you about that a little later in the evening. Tonight, we are considering zoning and design standards that will make possible future developments that reflect the values and the priorities of the community according to the framework plan that was developed over the last 5 or 6 months. This is the last phase of our work. And I'm excited that we're all here tonight. But before we get started, I am very pleased to introduce Commissioner Paul Savas, who has been a supporter of our work and who is with us this evening. Commissioner.
Thank you, Valerie. Glad to be here tonight. I've always wanted to attend every one of these that I could. Unfortunately, that's not all of them, but I am pleased to be here tonight and to see the good work you're all doing. I want to thank both Valerie and Ann for their leadership on this committee and the participation of the members of the committee as well, and all those who attended tonight in the past meetings. As Valerie stated quite accurately, you know, normally we do these things in public, and there's, I always felt I had a great sense of synergy and discussion and socializing, and you walk around a room but we can't do that today. We're in a COVID environment, and to aggravate that or exacerbate that a little bit with these fires and all the other complexities in our lives today, I know it's impacting people's ability to attend these meetings. So these will be recorded and available to be linked on in the future. So for those of you who have friends or people or neighbors interested, there'll be a way to participate and link into a lot of the meetings, I believe. So staff can always help you with that. But I do want, again, I want to express my gratitude for everyone's involvement and the leadership here, and look forward to seeing what you all have tonight with this workshop. And I'll turn it back to Valerie. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Savas. And I think at this point, the consultant team is going to go ahead and jump in here and get us rolling for the sake of time. So I want to roll through our agenda this evening just to give you a sense of what to expect. So we're going to start by going through a brief project overview. We're going to talk about the refined framework plan that we've been developing with the Citizen Advisory Committee. We will then jump into a larger discussion about Zoning 101. So what is zoning? What does it do? Why are we working on it as part of this project? And then talk specifically about the development and design standards that we have been working on and are in the process of drafting up, specifically to respond to the framework plan and the guiding principles that we've developed with the CAC. We're then going to open it up for a discussion where we would love to hear from members of the audience this evening. get your thoughts and opinions on things, and then conclude with a quick overview of next steps. So talk about our schedule and where this project is headed. I also just want to encourage people to use the question and answer dialog box. You can find that it's kind of a little green conversation bubble down at the bottom center of your Zoom menu. That's a great way to make this discussion a little bit more interactive as technology will allow, for us to be able to respond to some of your concerns and questions this evening. So with that, I want to give just a quick reminder of our project study area for this effort. So we're really focused on the half-mile around the Park Avenue Transit Station. And more specifically, that area that's within unincorporated Clackamas County. And then even more specifically within that, our focus for the discussion this evening is really going to be on that pink zone, the general commercial C3 zone that sits directly adjacent to McLaughlin Boulevard, and the multifamily residential zone that's shown in orange directly adjacent to that, because that's really the focal point for the update to the development and design standards that are currently underway. This project effort has been broken up into 3 major components. So we started the process by defining community values and vision, that February workshop that Valerie was talking about, then moving on to starting to illustrate where those values and vision might occur and how through a framework plan, this 20-year roadmap for the area. And then our final phase for this project is to update the development and design standards. So the regulations that dictate what developers can and cannot do in the area, so that it's in alignment with the 20-year roadmap, that framework plan. So quickly on the ground today, we want to give just a snapshot of existing conditions. This is a slightly different view of the project study area. So shown in pink again is that general commercial area that's directly adjacent to McLaughlin Boulevard. And then directly adjacent to that on the west and the east is that multifamily residential area shown in orange. And what's interesting about those two areas is even if I turn those colored blocks off, you can still kind of see those zones apparent on this aerial photograph, because interestingly, that general commercial area is a lot of asphalt right now. There's a lot of surface parking directly adjacent to McLaughlin Boulevard, and then to the side of that, you can just start to see this lovely vegetation, all of these great trees that we've been hearing about from the community that really give it its sense of identity. One other kind of interesting thing to note about this study area too is that for a pedestrian, you have to walk about 2,800 feet from the Park Avenue Max station to the next safe crossing across McLaughlin Boulevard. And that's about 3 times the length that would be recommended for a walkable area according to national and international urban design best practices. Moving on to the guiding principles, what we heard in terms of values and vision from the community. And I want to reinforce that these were crafted by the Citizen Advisory Committee. This was not language drafted by the consultant team. It was drafted by citizens of the area. So what we heard as a set of priorities here, number 1, increase employment opportunities. 2, increase the diversity and accessibility of housing choices. Provide safe locations and crossings and connections specifically for walking and biking in the area. Cultivate a heart and hub for neighborhood activity. Create community gathering spaces, basically places for people to come together in the neighborhood. Treat natural systems as a benefit. It's a part of the identity for the community, and it should be an integral part of any new development that happens for the area. And finally, promoting resilient and sustainable systems and infrastructure as a priority. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Emma Quinn to walk us through the refined framework plan and how we started to translate that into a map diagram for the area.
So as Valerie hinted at earlier, this framework plan is really a big vision, 20-year roadmap for development that is coming in the future of the Park Avenue area. And the way to read this plan is something that we would hope to see in the future. It's what the CAC agreed to do, and it's the exact alignment of all of the different elements is subject to change as more study is done in the area, and this is just really intended to give a high-level picture of what could occur in the area. So we looked at this suite of elements and have suggested this framework based on what we've heard from the community. We look at the land use and development character. We've identified some areas for neighborhood hubs and active centers. We've located active ground floor design, areas for pedestrian and bicycle connectivity improvements, locating new street crossing improvements across McLaughlin, and then also identified some opportunities for landscape and planting improvements in the area to really focus on that neighborhood resiliency and sustainability. So the first element that we looked at were the different, so here's an overall picture of the final framework plan. Again, that roadmap for future of development in the Park Avenue area. You can see all the different layers of those elements and how they come together. The first element that we looked at were the development districts, and these represent the character and the quality of development and intensity of development that will happen in these different areas. The red development character area is that current general commercial zone, and that is more of a commercial and residential mixed-use district adjacent to McLaughlin. And then the orange areas represent a multifamily residential transition district that would have more of a multifamily character to it. And this framework plan shows the single-family residential zone, which will not be impacted by any of the new design and development standards, but we recognize that it's important to note where that's located for context of the framework. And we've been very sensitive to that single-family residential zone and making sure that the character of that area of the neighborhood is really preserved. So the next area that we looked at were landscape and planting improvements. And the landscaping and green spaces really will enhance the beauty of the neighborhood. We have set an intention to really preserve the existing oak trees in the neighborhood and improve resiliency and sustainability through stormwater planters, landscape buffers, and a network of green spaces and open spaces. So it's proposed that any new connections would be landscaped, and then we've also proposed landscaping and planting improvements along the existing major connectors of Park Avenue, McLaughlin, and Oakfield Road. Next, we looked at the bike and pedestrian connections. Those thicker dashed lines are new bike and pedestrian connections and would serve as the primary connectors through the neighborhood, really connecting those existing and new residential areas to essential community resources that would be developed adjacent to McLaughlin Boulevard. And we're suggesting that those primary connectors are located along Silver Springs Road and Torbank Road. Next, we identified safe crossing locations. Going back to what Erin said about universal urban design best practices, we've identified 5 alignments for those crossing improvements that really increase the walkability and safety of the McLaughlin corridor. And those crossing improvements could vary based on the location, but generally that would look like pavement or material changes, push button signals, or adding medians and safe refuges perhaps in the middle of McLaughlin. Next, we looked at the active street design. And active street design just talks about how the buildings and the development interact with the sidewalk and the areas where people are walking. So these would be things like frequent building entries and doors, windows at the ground floor level, and just building facades that look interesting and inviting and welcoming to humans. Having more windows and transparency in buildings creates an eyes on the street environment, which will help improve the safety and comfort of these new pedestrian connections that we've identified in the framework plan. And then finally, the neighborhood hubs really will pull everything together, pull all the new development together, and serve as active places and natural community gathering spaces where people can meet as they're walking and biking to complete errands, or just using those services that are being developed, who are really focused on those who live in the neighborhood. So we identified these 2 locations for hubs to really provide flexibility in the development that could potentially happen along and adjacent to McLaughlin, to really create special neighborhood centers for the Park Avenue area. Next, I would like to introduce Ann Muir, the Vice Chair of the Citizen Advisory Committee, to talk a little bit more about how we arrived at this framework plan and the process that the CAC went through to help draw this out.
Thanks, Emma Quinn. Yes, it's. I just want to take a moment to describe the process that we went through as we put this work together. It's we had a lot of interesting conversations. You've seen now in Emma Quinn's presentation the map diagrams. We started out with several different map diagrams that we could imagine how it is that we could take the principles that we'd come up with and manifest them on the ground. So we had lots of options that we worked with, and with the committee meetings, always by Zoom, talking about them and having the opportunity as individual committee members to get the information online and through the mail and in hard copy to really look at the different possibilities, and then conversations in our meetings and opportunities to give information back to the Sarah architects so we could move forward. And so it was the committee working as we got to more specific possibilities, and then a community survey that we had put out, which we had very successful responses to. Then we took the community input and brought that back to our committee, and with the information there, our input, and the architects at Sarah's incredible ability to take all of our words and put them on paper, we came up with this final framework. It was an interesting process. We had a lot of discussions about topography, how people work now, what's good, what we like, what we don't like. It was a very interactive and community involved process.
That's great. Thank you, Anne. So at this point, we are going to start to dig into the ever enticing topic of zoning. So Elizabeth Decker from Jet Planning, who is our code expert for this project, is going to be our guide through what is zoning and how does it apply to this project.
Great, thank you, Erin, and thank you all for being here in the midst of sort of difficulties upon difficulties. So for those of you here tonight or that have a chance to look at this later, we'd like to give you a little background about what's zoning and how it's going to help us implement some of the principles in the framework plan that the community has put together. So first of all, there's a couple different terms that we'll use tonight. We'll try to be consistent, but you know, if we slip up, they're essentially interchangeable. We're talking about zoning more broadly. And then there's some more specific terms. You'll hear us talk about the development and design standards as a piece of this project. But zoning generally includes both a mapping component, so those different colors on the map maps that we've seen that divide an area into basic zones of different types of activities. And then accompanying that map is a set of written standards that detail what type of development is allowed in each of those, what you can do, how it can be built, what it needs to look like. And so what we're working on tonight is the written part, taking some of these mapping components that have been pretty set and then translating them into some standards to make sure that development in the future is consistent with the community vision. So the mapping component for this North Urban area, which includes the Park Avenue Station area, is shown here. So, you know, planners, get out their crayon box. We all have our own secret crayon box. They really do. No, I'm joking. And, you know, generally the pinks and the reds are commercial areas, and yellows yellows to oranges are generally residential areas. And the more intense, the darker oranges are higher density, lighter yellows are lower density. So when we zoom into our area, for the project area, again, you see similar color scheme here. So we are most interested for this project in the pinkish reddish areas along McLaughlin. That's the general commercial zone, or C3. And then the MR1 is the medium density residential in the light orange, immediately to the east and the west of the pink. Since the zoning map is pretty well set for this area, what we're interested in is the zoning standards themselves and what types of development is allowed within these two zones. And again, as Emma Quinn mentioned earlier, we're not proposing to change any of either the mapping or the standards for the single family neighborhoods further east and west from this central corridor. So next. So generally those written standards that we're talking about that are codified in Clackamas County, it's called the ZDO, the Zoning and Development Ordinance, or the zoning code more generally, needs to address what types of activities can be allowed in each zone, what it needs to look at, both in terms of individual buildings as well as across the whole site, and then how it gets approved and how you make sure that it's reviewed to ensure that it meets those standards. And I put that in because that is an important part of code. We aren't proposing any changes to the review processes. Those are generally working, so I'm not going to talk about it anymore tonight, but just that is something in zoning codes generally. Next. All right, so classic zoning, where we generally like to dive in and start framing our thinking around zoning, is by uses. And that's the way that zoning codes address the question of what types of development can you do here? What kinds of activities are encouraged and supported? And which kinds of activities are not intended to match the character and the purpose of the district. So, you might imagine in a commercial zone, this is a variety of the commercial zones in Clackamas County, but you don't need to squint to try to read it all. The point is just to illustrate that there's a number of different zones, each with their own acronym, because planners love acronyms, and then the individual uses are detailed about whether that is a permitted use in various districts, a conditional use, which means it's kind of like a yes, maybe, or a no, right? So a permitted use is a yes, a conditional use is maybe, if you can do it in a way that doesn't create impacts to your adjacent neighbors, and a prohibited use is a no, means that just really isn't compatible here. So a commercial zone is pretty broad in terms of what types of uses it allows, right? We're trying to get a range of retail, services, employment, offices. You can also do multifamily residential in these general commercial zones. So there's a pretty broad range, as opposed to, if you were to look at a use table for residential zones, it's going to be much more narrow because it's only focused on certain types of residential zones or residential uses that match the purpose of that zone. So you're not going to allow, a commercial bookbinding operation, say, or a industrial warehouse in a residential zone. So we're using the use table generally to control the level of activity and make sure that it fits with all the other uses in the zones. Okay, next. And then once we decide sort of what's going on with the development, we want to use the zoning code standards to address the intensity of the development. So how much development, how big it is, and just sort of its overall bulk and presence on the site. And again, we're trying to scale that to the character and the purpose of the different districts. So residential districts can range from a really low density to a very high density. And so those standards, we're going to be looking to modify dimensional standards that address height, for height of the buildings, tools like setbacks, how far buildings have to be set back from property lines. And then of course, residential zoning is often focused on the dreaded D word, density, which is trying sort of a rough tool to control the intensity of development. And we will talk a little about density here with the different zones we're talking about. And I think just as we're leading into it, I would like to, point out that density can be a fairly inaccurate tool because it measures how many housing units are permitted per acre. But it says nothing about the size of those units, which can really vary. You know, a studio apartment has a much smaller footprint than a single family house. So 20 single family houses wouldn't fit in the same area where 20 studio apartments would. So, but we would still call both of them 20 unit per acre in terms of a density standard. So just keep in mind that it's a rough tool. It's a bit of a spectrum. And so we're really looking to control the overall scale of development, not just the density of units, when we're thinking about sizing development to the character and scale of individual zoning districts. When we switch over and take a look at the intensity of development in commercial areas, we're also looking at those height and setbacks. And in some cases, zoning codes would use a floor area ratio metric rather than density. And that's just a way to say how much square footage of building area is located on the site relative to the size of the site. So the diagram on the right shows a couple different ways that your floor area ratio could be situated on your site. So, you know, for example, if you have a 1.0 FAR, means that you have one story development that covers the entirety of the site. Now, you could also sort of chop that up, make a multi-story development that covers only a portion of the site. You might still have the same FAR, but it looks different. It's the same overall bulk, just some different height and dimensional standards. So that's another tool that we get at to regulate the intensity of development. Next. And then really the heart of zoning code, where we spend, you know, where code writers like me and people that are looking to develop projects, where we really need to focus our energies and our best tools to implement the framework plan on this project is within the development and design standards. That's one component of the zoning code. So those address on from a large scale to a fine scale, to a fine level of detail, what exactly the development needs to look like. So it starts from, you know, on the left, you see the large scale, talking about generally from the site, how the development should relate to the street, how the buildings are going to be placed. We get into the massing pieces, the intensity of development we were just talking about. And as we work more towards these fine-grained details, we're looking at the form of the buildings, the different facade components, you know, really what does it look like if you're standing in front of the building, and how does a pedestrian or other users interact with the building, all the way to, you know, some more fine-grained design details. So things like what types of materials and window treatments are going to be part of that building to make it fit in with the district. Okay. So if you take all those different pieces that we're talking about and put them together, you know, on a specific site, here, what they could regulate could include, we like to think of it in terms of how the standards apply on private property first. So it's going to regulate everything from the building height to how the, oh, sorry, can you go back? Thanks. The building height, how the, where the building is located relative to the property lines, what the front facade looks like, where the windows are, where the awnings, the signage, the entryways are located, some of the more functional building features of the site, so where off-street parking is located, how much of it there is, what other types of non-motorized vehicular connections there are, and just some other pieces, so those kinds of pieces. And then within the public right-of-way, dun, 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 dun. The zoning code also has something to say about how the building relates to the street, the width of the sidewalk there, what kinds of street trees, lighting, and landscaping are going to be required. Sometimes even the zoning code might have something to say about how wide the street is, whether it includes on-street parking, buffered bike lanes, how many travel lanes. So all these pieces are working together to, you know, there's this invisible line between the private property and the public right-of-way, but all together it creates the experience and the physical environment that we're all dealing with when we're walking down the street. Okay. So hopefully I've convinced you about some of the important things that zoning code can do and different tools that we're going to use to implement the framework plan. But it's also important to realize what zoning code can't do. So, you know, zoning is definitely going to support the framework plan here, but it's more appropriate to think of it like the rules of a board game rather than a particular outcome of a board game, right? Meaning that the zoning code allows certain things and prohibits certain things, generally speaking, within those zones that are defined. But it doesn't compel a particular outcome at a really fine-grained level of detail. So things like whether there's going to be a grocery store on this corner or that corner, that isn't an outcome that the zoning code can control. It can permit grocery stores. It can encourage that those that are built, you know, have entryways that are accessible to people that are walking or biking or taking transit or driving their cars to get to the site, but it can't require any particular development to get built or require when it would get built. So zoning doesn't have much to say about the timing of development. Development timing really still responds to market conditions and individual property owners and when and if they choose to move forward. Most important also, zoning doesn't require anybody to change anything on their existing property until they're ready to do so. So a lot of the changes that we're talking about tonight to the zoning code in order to support that framework plan are not meant to, you know, erase anything on the ground tonight, that erase anything on the ground today. They just create options for the next stage of development when and if those property owners choose to redevelop the property and are looking to make some changes. And I think an important caveat too to end with is that zoning, you know, we talked about the private side and the public side of the line and the types of the sidewalk and the street trees and the roadway improvements. Zoning code can have something to say about those public infrastructure pieces, but it can't by itself deliver, you know, a full and complete public infrastructure network. Zoning's only going to trigger development of some of those pieces at the time of an individual site development. So there are a lot of infrastructure projects, such as, you know, improving an entire streetscape along this corridor, that really are going to need a more comprehensive and probably a county-led plan in order to get that done. Zoning can contribute to pieces of it, but by itself, zoning can't complete all of those public infrastructure projects that we'll be looking for. Okay. But it still can do a lot. So we have spent some time developing these draft code concepts for your consideration tonight. We'll be looking for your feedback. We have some time for discussion tonight. So that's your chance both to like ask questions to help clarify and give us some feedback if, you know, there are things that stand out to you about things that work or don't work. But even more importantly, we have the public survey up, the online survey, as a way to get some of your feedback on some of these specific concepts and let us know what you're thinking about those and how they should be targeted and refined as we move into writing the actual zoning standards. So what we're trying to do here is to take this framework plan that, you know, as Anne described, has really been developed with a lot of community input. And to the extent that zoning code can support this framework plan, we're looking at developing some use standards, those massing and intensity standards, landscaping standards, environmental protection standards, the connectivity standards to get this new street grid that we're looking at, and some design standards, particularly focusing on these active ground floor areas in sort of the light blue highlight. With the understanding that there will also need to be some additional aspects implemented outside of the code, particularly those public infrastructure projects that I mentioned. Okay, next. All right, so again, you know, pop quiz for tonight. If you learn nothing else, I hope you take away that, you know, the reddish area is commercial and the orangish area is medium density residential. Okay, next. So first piece, you know, as we think about building up each of those elements of the framework plan, is we're looking at these, how to create these green spaces along these corridors. So first piece is that we have an opportunity to create these green streetscapes through street tree and landscaping requirements in front of buildings. We can also look at overall site landscaping requirements. So, in this district, we're probably looking at between 15 to 25% of the site being landscaped. And that we're looking at some innovative ways that could integrate stormwater treatments, could integrate retention of those existing trees. It doesn't have to be all new plantings. And in fact, there's some opportunities to align with the tree protection standards to better incentivize retaining existing trees. And then we're also going to uphold and apply all of the protections for environmentally sensitive areas. There's a couple of creeks and riparian areas, and those will remain protected from development with this project, or with any development that happens within this project area going forward. Okay, next. Okay, and we also want to use the zoning code to support connectivity through a couple different tools. First of all, we will be integrating into the zoning code some requirements about where new connections are required, so that if a site gets developed, they'll have to set aside some room for these new connections to be made, and also talk about the type of connection required. So what how big it needs to be and what different types of travel it needs to serve. Is it going to be a larger street that can serve a whole mix of vehicles and pedestrians and bikes? Or as you kind of see with the different weights of dashed lines here, is it more appropriate as a facility geared at bicyclists and pedestrians? So these will be larger and smaller. These won't all be a standard profile local street being carved through this neighborhood. We will need to do some future work. We'll use the zoning code to set the basis, but there will be more work that needs to be done on exactly what those street design cross sections will be needed for these different types of streets so that they match the community vision there. Okay, next. And then along both existing streets like McLaughlin and these new connections that we're trying to create, it's important that the zoning code talk about how development on the sites relates to these streets, because that's how site visitors experience the site and are able to access it. So we'll be looking to write zoning standards and design standards that are differentiated for McLaughlin and for these perpendicular streets along Silver Springs and Torbank. And we'll generally just to acknowledge the speed and the pedestrian comfort that's going to be differentiated along these two types of streets. So we'll be looking at tools like requirements for prominent building entryways, window coverage along the ground floor, the detailing along the facade, and some articulation to make sure that there's something of interest and to prevent blank walls. As well as more softer elements like landscaping and pedestrian amenities like plazas, potentially located near some of those to support those neighborhood hubs that we're looking at. Okay, next. So the way that some of this might look on the sites. So on the left, you see an example of existing development. So right now, a lot of the development along McLaughlin, both in this stretch as well as further south of here, you see a large front setback between the street and the buildings that allows a lot of parking. And then there's really no buffer between those parking areas and the street. So, you could imagine as a pedestrian, and in fact, many of you have probably experienced as a pedestrian walking down this part of McLaughlin, it's not a very comfortable place. It's not really a place that you want to be, or that you feel, connected or compelled to visit these businesses. It's much easier, and the design of these sites is to encourage visitors that arrive by car. Now, the current standards in the zoning code would not permit this kind of development today. There's actually a 20-foot maximum setback, so that would take out all of this parking between the building and the street, and the parking would need to be to the side or the rear. And we, for this district, want to think about how we build and even add to those standards. So the proposed code concepts that we're looking at in the Park Avenue station area is looking at a maximum setback along these different streets that includes some landscaping and buffering, and more engagement between the buildings and public space with things like entryways and more ground floor windows. Okay, next. So again, if you remember that invisible line, the property line, so if you're standing on the sidewalk looking at the building, between the private site and the sidewalk, we're going to be looking at standards that emphasize building frontage by bringing those buildings closer up to that invisible line, and then using pedestrian plazas, trees, and landscaping, right along that interface, which means we need to move the parking to the side or rear in order to create those opportunities. And then, again, if you're imagining standing on the sidewalk, this will be complemented by some elements within the public right-of-way, such as we're looking at, does it make sense to have expanded sidewalks, more street trees, protected bike lanes, on-street parking, those types of features that really provide not the mirror image, but the complementary half that creates the streetscape. Okay, next. All right, and the next concept, these concepts that we're talking about so far are going to apply in both the commercial as well as the residential districts. So that's why we're going through these first. So the next piece is really thinking about how we use these sites and what are our priorities in terms of how the site gets developed and how, what percentage of the land within a given site is used for different uses. So if you remember, 2 of our 6 guiding principles are about increasing housing and increasing employment opportunities. And both of those things happen within buildings, right? So we are looking at how can we increase the percentage of the site that can be used for buildings in order to increase those housing and employment opportunities. And in order to do so, the other 2 main components are open space as well as off-street parking areas. Now, we've heard a lot about how trees and open space and landscaping are very important to the district. So we want to find ways to maintain the open space requirements or possibly increase them through some selective targeting. But that means that we're really looking at reducing the parking requirements so that that portion of the site can shrink and allow the open space and the building areas to occupy a larger percentage of the site. And that brings it into more of a balance that's in line with the framework plan type of development vision. So next. So again, it helps us achieve these 3 things: more room for buildings, maintaining the room for open space, courtyards, and landscaping, and that means we need to look at reducing parking areas. Okay. And so to accomplish that, what we're looking at for off-street parking is bringing the minimum parking ratios for residential development down. And again, keep in mind, this is for those multifamily developments in the general commercial area, as well as some of the medium density residential developments in the orange area. We're not talking, again, about any development in single family neighborhoods. Excuse me. So we're looking at bringing the ratio closer to a 1-to-1 ratio, which, to keep in mind, this is a regulatory minimum. That's how zoning code works. Zoning code is not there to tell an individual developer precisely how many spaces, is the optimal number of spaces to build. Developers have many other tools that they're looking at when they're trying to decide how much parking to build. It's not just what the code says, it's what fits on the site, it's what they expect their future customers to need. It even is, banks surprisingly can get into the requirements for how many spaces are required because they won't lend money on projects that don't meet what they think is going to be successful. So there's a lot of pieces that go into parking, and the zoning code only sets a regulatory minimum. So we are looking at trying to sort of right size that minimum and leave some flexibility for developers to build the parking that meets all those other requirements. We're also exploring reducing some minimum parking ratios for commercial development, particularly for sites that have a mix of uses or that can share parking with other complementary uses nearby. We think that reducing these minimum parking ratios for both residential and commercial allows us to get more housing, more job opportunities, and really take advantage of the access to high quality transit, which defines the area. That's why we're planning here in the Park Avenue Station area. And then we'll also be looking at some more targeted reductions that individual sites could qualify for rather than district-wide. So things like, the most proximate to transit, or sites that provide better enhanced bike parking facilities, particular uses like affordable housing or senior housing, mixed-use sites, looking at shared parking, and then other innovative parking management tools like car sharing, vehicle charging, other types of like that. Okay, next. All right, now, and then drilling down some of the pieces, some of the code concepts that apply specifically in the general commercial area are going to be, first of all, if you think back to that use table that we talked about, the general commercial, or the C3 zone, as it's technically known, allows a very broad range of commercial, employment, and multifamily residential uses. And we propose to keep the majority of those the same. And further, all existing development in the district is going to remain permitted, even if we propose some changes to the standards for new uses going forward. So there are some standards right now about, I guess I'll highlight some of the ones that we are going to prohibit or are considering limiting for new development. So auto-oriented uses, we're proposing to limit new uses like a car wash, gas station, car sales, or car repair uses. Again, that wouldn't, we know there's a number of those uses in the district already. We're not proposing to, try to erase those or eliminate those from the district tomorrow. Those uses would be allowed to continue in business. They could even sell to a new owner if they wanted to continue the business, in the same site. But we would limit any new uses like that so that there's more opportunities for the other types of uses that we're seeing in the framework plan. Likewise, we're looking at prohibiting new self-storage and commercial storage, as well as outdoor storage. What we are looking at adding to the district is looking at some limited manufacturing uses. Now, you might be scratching your head thinking, now how could manufacturing fit into a commercial district? And the idea here is that there is some on-site production of raw materials, things like food and beverages, has already been addressed, but even thinking a little more widely about, perhaps artisanal goods. So maybe you're taking leather or woodworking, something like that, glass blowing. Can't promise there's going to be a glass blowing studio, but we're trying to create some opportunities for uses, also for maker spaces where people could have things like 3D printers and be transforming materials into, it's technically manufacturing, but they're creating new products within a building with minimal offsite impact. So we're looking at adding that to the district, and then we're also looking at where could be some places for more vibrant outdoor uses rather than outdoor storage. So things like cafe seating, street vendors, and sidewalk sales. So that's how we're thinking of shifting the standards, again, just for new development going forward. Next. So here's some illustrations, of some of the types of changes we're looking at. Some of, storage car uses that, again, existing ones would stay, but new ones would not be allowed to locate within the district, and we'd be making room for more sidewalk cafes and brew pubs, ostensibly. All right, then we're going to look at our tools for development intensity and apply them within this general commercial zone. So within the commercial scale, right now, there is no maximum, there's really no height or floor area requirements. And we have found that we didn't hear any concerns about that. It provides the most flexibility and does not seem to have led to any, outsized projects coming forward or concerns about bulk. So we would like to preserve that flexibility and are proposing no changes there. On the residential side, however, right now there's a maximum of 25 units per acre, which again, we're talking about the area right on McLaughlin, where really perhaps the most intense development would be suitable. And so what we heard from a series of interviews with developers is that really 50 to 100 units per acre And again, keep in mind these units are of varying sizes, but that is sort of the end target for projects that they're ballparking in order to make them financially feasible to build and in order to provide the most housing opportunities, particularly in amenity-rich areas like this where there's great transit access. So we're looking at a way to really open up that density for this area because it has really suppressed any development opportunities of multifamily residential from what we've heard. That means we'd probably be looking at 4 to 5 story developments most likely. There's some construction development economics that makes 4 stories a really good target, but we are not proposing a firm height limit other than what is right for the market and the scale that can be supported. Also keeping in mind that the requirements for on-site landscaping and the requirements for on-site parking, are going to be sort of checks and balances on what actual density is going to be able to be realistically developed on these sites. To make sure that our limited sites are used wisely, we will continue requiring a minimum density of 22.5 units per acre. Okay, next. So to give you a sense of, what some of these projects might look like, the kind of scale that we're looking at, the 50 units an acre, you're probably looking at 3, potentially 4 stories. Depends on how large the sites are, of course, for some of those bottom photos. And then if sites were pushing up towards more like 100 units per acre, that's when you'd start to see going up to 5 stories or 4 or 5 or potentially more. But right now, again, for various reasons, we don't see development at that intense scale in the next, in the near term in this district. Okay. So if we translate that into some diagrams and what that might look like on the ground, right now that maximum 25 units per acre is really suppressing residential development potential, and keeping it pretty low scale. And opening it up to that higher range would allow sites to be developed up to that 4 to 5 stories and maximize housing opportunities here. Okay. All right, and moving outward, so stepping away from the most intense uses and scale of development on McLaughlin in these medium density residential neighborhoods, we are looking at really a different approach to residential. We want to be sensitive here that this is a transition zone. And so for the most part, we are proposing to maintain the existing minimum and maximum density range of 9.6 to 12 units per acre for most residential types. Right now there's townhouses, duplexes, triplexes, multifamily at a pretty small scale, and manufactured dwelling parks that are permitted here, and those would all continue to be permitted at that existing density range. This is another case where the current standards don't permit any new single-family detached dwellings, but all existing homes are grandfathered in. So again, it's not trying to uproot anything that's in place right now, but any new development needs to provide an alternative and a different mix. And based on some of the community feedback that we've gotten, as well as just sort of the, shall we say, the low-hanging fruit in this district, the code concepts of what we would like to contribute with these code standards towards meeting the framework plan is introducing new cottage cluster development opportunities to add to the existing uses. So rather than tweak some of those existing uses that are already permitted, we want to add a new type of development that's a cottage cluster. Those are smaller format houses with more of them on a given site. So more units, but smaller scale. So the overall bulk is somewhat compatible, but allows for smaller, sometimes more affordable units and some more creativity in site layouts. To make that happen, cottage cluster projects need a higher density because they're smaller. So we'd be looking at, at least probably 24 units per acre, double the density, because these could be as small as say 900 square feet each. So we'll be looking at that. The reason that we're focusing on cottage clusters exclusively with this project in the MR1 is that the county is going to be doing a much more comprehensive look at its single family zones to add in some middle housing if you've been following implementation of House Bill 2001. And that's going to sort of trigger some additional review of this zone as well as a medium density zone. So we thought it would be more appropriate to incorporate that with the overall county process. And so that's why we're coming forward with cottage clusters now. So to give you an idea what these might look like. Dun, dun, dun. You know, as you can see in this photo on the left, the cottage clusters, the strength of this development type, and I think why it appeals to so many people and so many communities, including myself, is that it brings together more smaller units and provides these common gathering spaces. You know, in this particular example, there's some really great garden space and green space, and but that can vary depending on the different developments. And again, we'll continue to allow things like townhouses, duplexes, other types of attached development in this zone. Okay, next. And then, you know, to tie it all back to where we started, again, these zoning standards are trying to, you know, create some rules and guide and support the types of development that would fulfill the guiding principles for the Park Avenue Station area. So to tie it back to those principles, in terms of increasing employment opportunities, we're looking to contribute to that by limiting more auto-oriented and uses that produce relatively few jobs, like self-storage. And we're looking to permit on-site manufacturing that creates some new and hopefully flexible types of employment as, you know, we move towards greater uncertainty about what the future looks like there. In terms of increasing housing choices, that is a key component of the code changes. One that we heard loud and clear from our discussions with the community, and particularly with affordable housing developers, about the opportunity, but to create some multifamily housing here, but the need to increase the density in the in the C3 zone. Excuse me for that typo there. And then we're looking to introduce that cottage cluster development opportunity to expand residential options in the MR1 zone. And to accomplish both of those, we need to reduce the area required for off-street parking. In terms of supporting bicycle and pedestrian connections, that's where requiring these new connections through the development sites is going to be really important as part of future redevelopment, and making sure that those connections are scaled to the desired mode. So whether it's a wider facility that can accommodate cars as well as bicycles and pedestrians, or whether some of those connections are specifically for bikes and pedestrians, you know, limited to emergency access only. Getting the scale of that right is going to be important. And making the most out of those new connections by requiring active street design, connections to the street and buildings that engage people traveling along those streets is going to be really important. Next piece. And then we'll be looking at some tools to support neighborhood hubs. Again, requiring that active ground floor design. We'll make sure that the neighborhood hub design, or the neighborhood hub areas are targeted for active ground floor design. That will include helping the buildings engage with the street with reduced setbacks, and allowing more active outdoor uses like cafe seating and pedestrian plazas. We're also looking to support landscaping and planting improvements across the district by requiring more street trees and landscaping along the front of buildings that will enhance streets and the new connections we're adding. We're also looking at maintaining those landscaping requirements, the overall site minimums for new development to make sure that green spaces as well as stormwater facilities as required can be integrated into site design, and also upholding the existing tree protection standards, looking at ways to integrate preservation of existing vegetation into the overall site design and landscaping. And, you know, while all those pieces support sustainable systems, more generally, more specifically for sustainable systems, we will be looking at using some existing standards in the code that require sustainability features integrated into each development, as well as solar setbacks. And we will be applying all the protections for environmentally sensitive areas in this study area to make sure that those assets are preserved. So with that, I think we're going to turn it over to some questions and discussion. And so Erin, are you the one that's going to tell us how we do this?
Yeah. So thank you very much, Elizabeth. That was a great presentation. So at this point, we would love to hear from participants this evening. And the best way to do that is to type any questions, comments, thoughts you want us to be considering as part of this discussion into the question and answer field. Again, that's that little kind of green conversation bubble down in the bottom center of your Zoom menu. So feel free to click on that and add anything in that you'd like to contribute to the conversation. I think as we kind of wait to see if folks have any questions that they would like us to answer, we also have a few questions that we've prepared. We can think of this as sort of stump the code expert.
Oh, not fair.
That we'll kind of pepper in here. So I'll toss out one to begin with. You know, you talked, Elizabeth, a lot about limiting things like new car sales lots, drive-through restaurants, those types of things. And I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more to how those changes would support walkability and a stronger pedestrian environment, which is a key part of our framework plan.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Erin, for that insightful question. I will say, for those of you listening at home, these are actual questions we've heard through the project, and we're just sort of bringing them forward here. So those types of limiting things like car sales lots and drive-through restaurants supports walkability because those types of uses aren't walkable destinations. You know, you can't walk to a drive-through, more or less. You know, I actually tried to walk. I accidentally went to a Starbucks once that was only drive-through, and I tried to walk up, and I really struggled. We all really struggled for me to get my coffee, and God, I needed that coffee. So point being that, you know, if we limit those things that require cars, we are creating more opportunities for things that don't require cars. It also reduces the number of vehicles that are crossing pedestrian travel paths. So if you think about really active driveways, you know, it's harder to cross a driveway as a pedestrian if, you know, there's an active drive-through with lots of traffic coming through. It becomes, you know, another crosswalk and another barrier. Car sales, gas stations, you know, similar. They're, you know, gas stations more so than car sales lots, but, you know, you access those with a car. They serve cars. They don't, you know, generally serve pedestrians. I don't know that I've ever walked up to, you know, a car sales lot.
Do we have any questions yet? Or can I continue stumping the zoning code?
Ooh, we have two questions.
We have two. Why don't we go to those?
All right. All right. So we have a question from Linda Newman. If time allows, could you chat a bit more about what manufacturing might look like in the area?
Mm-hmm. Okay. So, you know, this is something that I've really gotten a chance to dig more into. So the kinds of manufacturing we're looking at, first of all, the idea is that you wouldn't know it was manufacturing from the outside. So the idea is this is all going to be inside spaces, and the buildings and the facades will have to meet all these active street design concepts, you know, some visual interests, some ground floor windows. So the buildings will be contributing to the overall district. In that way, they aren't, you know, we're not looking at just massive warehouses with, you know, tilt-up concrete walls. And then within the actual manufacturing use itself, you know, we're sort of playing around with how tightly we need to define it and how widely, you know, how permissive we can be. The county has already taken an interim step in addressing on-site manufacturing of food and beverage uses. So, you know, that's directly aimed at sort of the brew pub, the bakery that might have a wholesale and a retail operation on site, and they're transforming the raw material, the grain into flour and into products. So certainly we would do that. And it's sort of the next step of, would we want to allow, more of those artisan uses? We're also targeting, but if we allow those artisan uses, like, how do we make sure that it doesn't become, a full-on, logging and milling operations? So I think we have a couple tools there. One is by, limiting the impacts that can be created by these manufacturing uses. So, noise, odors, let's see, what else are we typically looking at? Smoke, vibration, emissions, all those things we can look at. I also think that by heightening the design and the site requirements, that, increases cost and might be less attractive to the type of developer that is just looking for, solely focusing on a more manufacturing type use, a heavy industrial use. So I think that there's going to be some self-selection there, but we want to make sure we have enough pieces in the code so that people arrive at that conclusion. And then the other piece about manufacturing is that there are only so many available sites in this subject area. So, we don't have the larger 5, 10, 20 acre sites that could be more intensive manufacturing. So we do want to focus on those higher value, higher employment uses, again, just to go back to these artisan food and beverage uses. And we're also looking at, something that is sometimes termed a maker space, which can be sort of like a flex industrial, where, again, you might be bringing in a 3D printer or some other materials that you're manufacturing, possibly as more like a prototype before you're ready to launch a large scale manufacturing operation. And we're hearing that there's more demand for this as employment is becoming more flexible. But we are working with, we have an economic development consultant on our team, and she's helping us understand what the demands are today, and at least into the near term, even if we can't predict 20 years out. So I hope that helps.
Great. We have another question from Casey Snowberger about parking. Are there minimums that will be put in place in conjunction specifically for employees? So I think this is in reference to commercial development.
Yeah, well, I think there's sort of two pieces. One is, what do we do in the zoning code? And two is, how do businesses, as they move forward, manage their parking with their employees? So I think that the key part for us at this stage is setting up parking minimums that are, low enough to support and catalyze development, and allow enough building area that creates these employment opportunities. In some ways, I don't want to sound cavalier, but in some ways, like, a parking problem is a good problem to have, just in the sense that, like, if we have a really active development area and we start getting a lot of employment, then we have some tools for parking management that we can employ. And so employees are actually one of the easier groups to address through parking management, because they have a direct relationship with their employer. So it's much easier for an employer to say, here are the ways, employees, that you may access the site. This many of you can get parking permits. This many of you need to find somewhere else to park. This, or we are going to offer bus passes, or we're going to create this new great bike parking area. I realize that isn't right for every employer. So certainly that's why there's a suite of tools, but there are many more experts on parking management and how you address it for employees. We'd certainly hope to take advantage of the MAC station here going forward. So there, to get back to the question, let's see, your concern is about employees parking in residential. And residential areas already experiencing folks parking there to get to the transit. So, right, and I think your point about sidewalks and infrastructure is, again, zoning will partly address that, but we are hoping that the overall vision for this area is adding in the sidewalks and the infrastructure that can support that going forward.
One thing, I was going to say, one thing we might add is that we understand that the TriMet Park and Ride is going to be expanding,
Mm.
which means that there will be more parking available for transit riders, which theoretically would reduce the pressure to park in some of the surrounding residential areas. So,
Yeah, and then there's also the potential that, you know, by creating more employment in this area, fewer people need to park and ride. They could just go to work without having to jump on transit from there.
yeah.
Great. We also have another question from Kelly McLean, who says, I live in the Orange area. If I choose to sell my home, this could create an extreme limitation on the pool of buyers I would be able to market to. I would be forced to sell only to a developer, correct?
Well, so sorry, that just jumped around a little. So the idea here is that, well, first of all, I would consult with a realtor on this question, and also with mortgage finance experts, because the real question, as I understand, is not the zoning code. The zoning code allows your home as it currently is, and allows your home to continue just as it is. It allows your home to be sold. It, you know, the zoning code is really agnostic about who owns that home. It's a home, it's there, and it can continue. The concern that sometimes comes up that I've heard is that sometimes, depending on how the zoning district is written, there can be concerns from banks about lending for new mortgages for homes where there are limitations, which, you know, perhaps then, yes, the pool of interested parties might be a little different. But, you know, again, that's why I would say start by talking to, you know, someone that is an expert in finance about the opportunities. And I don't want to comment on the specifics of the Orange area, the medium density residential, because we aren't changing any of those standards that address single family in this area with this project. So whatever your existing permissions are, then they will remain the same. So we're not changing anything with this project. And either the county might be able to give you some more specifics about how the standards apply to single family homes there. And yeah, mortgage finance could give you a better idea of who could, you know, what it would take to qualify for a mortgage to purchase your home.
Great. And another question from Linda Newman. This was specifically addressed to Tim, but I might also ask Karen Burek from the county to jump in on this one. So in regards to TriMet expanding the parking garage, she asks, is that an aspiration or a fact? And what are the timelines associated with that?
Oops. Sorry, I'm jumping in and out of my video. But it's our understanding from our conversations with TriMet that they are looking and coordinating with the FTA on how they can get funds that had been set aside during the development of the Orange Line to be able to build and construct that parking garage, expand on that parking garage. And so I have not heard recently if they've been successful, but they felt very confident that they would be able to access those funds. So if that is the case, I would anticipate that it could be within the next 5 years. But again, we haven't heard the specific timelines on that, but they are actively pursuing funding. So how I would answer the question.
Yep. Hey, Aaron, there was a question in the chat a while ago, so you may want to just look in there.
Alrighty.
Yeah, you know, I'll just go ahead and jump on Commissioner Paul Savas's question about the drive-through businesses. So yes, I agree that you know, most fast food businesses are only going to want to locate where they can put in a drive-through. They just aren't interested in sites where zoning doesn't permit that. And so, you know, yes, the short answer to your question is that many fast food restaurants are going to have to locate outside of this study area. You know, it's a relatively small study area, There's a good deal of other commercial area to the, within Clackamas County to the south where businesses that want that model would be able to locate. But what we're trying to do in this project area to support the framework plan and the community vision is to support specifically the types of restaurants and businesses in this case that are working from a different model that allow more of a pedestrian focused, either a dine-in or, walk in, grab your coffee, sit on in the sidewalk cafe in the COVID era, and someday we'll get to sit inside again. But that's the kind of business that would be, that would fit better within this area.
All right, and I think we have one other question in the chat window from Barbara West. It seems obvious to me that the kind of development you're speaking of will dribble over into the north of Courtney area. Does this planning exercise address those beyond the planning scope problems? And then a quick correction on that, south of Courtney.
So my first take on this is that many of the zoning code standards will be written to only apply north of Courtney within the study area. So as proposed, many of the things like the cottage clusters will only be permitted north of Courtney. And so there may be some pressure to dribble over, and then that will be a question for the county going forward. Do they want to expand some of these types of uses? They'll be able to look at what's been working and what hasn't been working in the Park Avenue station area before they make up their minds about how to change or expand any of those zoning permissions. And I mean, not to be glib, because there could also be, more general development potential or development pressure that extends to the south of Courtney. And, to be fair, I don't think that has been included within the scope of this exercise. But many of the specific approaches that we're proposing, the code will only permit north of Courtney. Any other thoughts from the team?
No.
We have one more question. I think this is kind of a follow-up to some of the discussion we were having a few minutes ago about parking impacts in residential areas. So again, from Casey Snowberger, I have a concern with inadvertently pushing some of the McLaughlin traffic to or from towards the residential side or portion of the commercial lots. For example, I'd like to discourage truckload in and out from being closer to the residential areas and pushing buildings closer to McLaughlin to tend to force trucks into the opposite side of the building. What can be done to help prevent that truck traffic and noise pollution in the residential areas?
Yeah, no, that's a really good concern, or a good point to raise. Not a good concern. There's no, but yeah, I can, for one, definitely sympathize with it. Where I'm located, I have a lot of truck loading noises, and would love to discourage those in my residential neighborhood. So I think, for one, that just gives me something else to think about that I will see how I can integrate into the code. My first thought is, we can require some kind of setback for loading areas from the residential areas. As you say, if we're going to rule out the front of McLaughlin, which, I still think is appropriate. We don't want to see loading bays and loading docks on the front of McLaughlin when we're trying to create a more walkable place. But if we want to keep it from, the interface with residential zones, there is, physical setbacks. There are some buffering techniques like landscape screens, hedges that could also help with the noise issues. And perhaps we could also put in something, I don't know if every site could support this, but certainly if it could go on the side rather than the rear would be an improvement. So I'll see how, I think that gives me a lot to think about, but we'll see how we can address that.
I also think, just thinking about the geometry of the situation, right now, a lot of those big sites along McLaughlin, at least in this study area, have really large surface parking areas and loading into buildings that tend to be pretty deep into the site. And we may actually be, even though the truck traffic may be on the side or behind buildings, the buildings will be much closer to McLaughlin. So the truck traffic, what little there may be actually farther away from the residential areas. And then if we do, as Elizabeth suggests, add some buffering through landscaping and other means, we might actually have a better situation than we have now. Now, also keep in mind, unless we get a grocery store, which I think everyone would really like to have, a lot of this commercial that we're talking about are really sort of small scale neighborhood things that, other than a grocery store, aren't going to be attracting the kind of big stuff, the big truck traffic. So if we do have a grocery store, we may need to think about the kind of buffering that would really mitigate a situation like that. So that's a great question, and it's it's a lot of stuff for us to think about.
Great. We have another question from Valerie Chapman, who asked, Elizabeth mentioned glass makers, but the recent experience with bullseye glass in Southeast Portland, terrible pollution, and an exception to regulations in a residential zone. So based on that, could you address manufacturing that's compatible with residential?
First, I would say, I don't know that, again, like we're not necessarily seeing glass making specifically, perhaps not the best example to have chosen. So I appreciate you pointing out some of those concerns around that. I guess if this doesn't sound too nitpicky, we're not proposing manufacturing in residential areas. We're only proposing it in the commercial area. And if there are concerns about the interface between the commercial zones and the residential zones, then I guess that's where I would suggest for one, we're looking at manufacturing that would be wholly enclosed within buildings. So that's going to limit a lot of the noise and odor impacts, a lot of those pollution issues. Now, I don't know all the bullseye problems in detail, but there are a lot of state regulations. This is one of those areas where zoning has a role to play, and there's a lot of other agencies that have a role to play as well. I would say that as far as zoning can control it, we'll be looking at trying to keep any manufacturing uses inside and to limit that outdoor storage that can really be non-compatible along the interface with residential. And then we could also look at some of those landscaping and buffering tools if there are specific concerns.
Yeah, and maybe I could add something here. I think a lot of this manufacturing that we're talking about are the types of activities that really would be compatible with residential walkable areas. For example, somebody who is making jewelry in the back of a building and then actually selling it out front. Mm-hmm. Or processing hops, into beer and selling it to people who actually live in the neighborhood or coming there. I really don't think that we're talking about, big manufacturing operations. And yeah, the bullseye glass is kind of an unfortunate situation, and I understand that there are new rules and regulations impacting businesses like those that would come into effect.
Great.
Yeah, I see that we're just about ready to wrap up, but one last thought on this. First of all, to acknowledge Valerie Chapman's point about, yes, we are proposing more residential uses in these commercial areas. So even though it's a commercial zone, there could be use adjacencies. But I still think most of these same tools are going to apply, keeping it inside. One tool that we could look at that I've seen other cities use is to have precisely what Tim's talking about, is we could have a requirement for that for a retail space as part of any on-site manufacturing, so that we're only attracting the types of manufacturing that is of that smaller scale and that has an interest in contributing to that walkable, more pedestrian type place.
Yeah.
Great. And we did have one last question from Casey Snowberger again. At one time, there was a desire for a hotel in the area. Would the design standards allow for that?
Yeah, hotels would remain a permitted use in this area, and the design standards themselves, you know, just sort of depend on how they were willing to design the hotel, and would they, you know, bring it up to, you know, where the setbacks are, and add the landscaping, and you know, comply with the parking and all the other pieces that we're looking for in this area. But a hotel could definitely contribute to the district.
Great. Thank you to all of the participants for the great questions. You saved Tim and I from having to run through a list of questions of our own, and you asked some excellent questions and had some excellent points, so we really appreciate it. I also want to encourage people who want to provide more feedback or who have additional comments to please go take the survey that's online. It has a lot of really detailed questions about on-site manufacturing and various other things that allow you to give input. What, you know, how do you feel about some of these proposed changes for the area? And we'd really love to hear your input through that survey. Before we fully wrap up for the evening, I just want to quickly share our schedule for the remainder of the project as well. Just to let you know that that online survey is going to be open through early October. So we're looking forward to seeing all of your responses in that. And then we'll be wrapping up the updates to the development and design standards. And then our kind of final big presentation for this project, we're thinking it's going to happen sometime in early November, is a presentation to the Board of County Commissioners. So that'll be a public hearing. So we are nearing the final stages of this project, which is very, very exciting. It's been a lot of community effort to get us here, and we're excited to have more community input in these final stages.
How many responses did we have to the last survey? Was it
About 289.
289? So that's the goal, everyone out there in TV land. It's a challenge. We'd like to see if you can exceed that.
Recruit your friends.
Recruit your friends. Challenge.
Right.
So before we close, I'd like to just take a moment on behalf of the Park Avenue Community Advisory Committee to thank our presenters tonight, and thank them for all of the work, and those who may have worked behind the scenes to make sure that the presentation was both clear and visible and available to as many people as possible. So thank you for your really hard work. I think you did a great job.
Thank you, Valerie.
Mm-hmm.
And thanks to everybody who's participated this evening. We really appreciate your time. We know that this is a really hard time to be contributing your time and energy to a project like this, and it means a lot. We really, truly appreciate it. So thank you very much. So on the screen right now, there's a link to the website where the survey is located and more information about this project. If you have any questions, want to ask specific clarifying questions about the project, please feel free to contact Karen Burig at Clackamas County. And again, we would love to see any input that you have to offer in that online survey.
With that, I think that we are done for this evening. Is everyone? Yes? Okay. Thank you again. Thank you to everyone who has been here, and be sure to do the survey.